I personally started from the beautiful feeling of belonging that I felt when I read the book. There was in the book a mysterious force that pulled me in, which was, now that I spent the last 35 years thinking about it, I think it was about this idea of connection with someone else and the difficulty of that and the longing in that, but in both. And the beautiful writing of Burroughs, his imagination. I almost never really had a sort of problem with the idea that the book was unfinished, because it wasn't unfinished in the sense of what he wanted to say about his anguish for Lee and Allerton.
Is he queer, or is he disembodied? In this video, I'm going to be giving a full breakdown of Luca Guadagnino's new film, Queer. I'll be talking about the storytelling techniques, visual metaphors, as well as the key deviations on the original book. I'll also be chatting to an expert on the book's author, who Luca Guadagnino brought in as a consultant for the film, so make sure you stick around to the end to hear all about that. But before we get into this video, I just want to leave a quick reminder to subscribe and leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps me out and frankly makes me feel really encouraged to talk about film. I appreciate it. Okay, everyone ready? Let's talk about the movie Queer. The story of Queer on the surface seems fairly simple. The film regards the various interactions between two men falling in and out of relations. Their push and pull style relationship leads them on a journey to the jungles of South America. There, they search for a mysterious plant that claims to make one telepathic. Perhaps taking it will allow these two to understand each other once and for all. So what starts out as a fairly conventional narrative then rapidly unravels into a surrealist sequence of visual metaphors. Our two central characters at play are William Bill Lee and Eugene Allerton, played by Daniel Craig and Drew Starkey respectively. Our protagonist, Lee, is an awkward, insecure middle-aged man who wanders the streets of Mexico City looking for men to spend the night with. He is immediately struck by the appearance of Allerton, whose elegant stature walks in front of Lee in slow motion. He is sort of like the way Tadzio is depicted in Visconti's film Death in Venice, an enigmatic figure that becomes an alluring object of desire. Additionally, this interaction of two people sharing a moment where they lock eyes in slow motion is so much like Wong Kar-wai's film In the Mood for Love, which labours on the idea that moments that pass us by can mean absolutely everything. Upon seeing Allerton, Lee is struck with one simple question: is he queer? Which is a complex one to consider, the answer even more so. Whilst Lee clumsily wears his emotions on his sleeve, Allerton is a very different person. In one of their various sexual moments, the book describes Allerton as having a curious detachment, the impersonal calm of an animal or a child. Allerton is on the one hand engaged and even amused by Lee, but then he disappears into a space somewhere in his own head. This is part what fuels the alluring mystery about him, but is also what desperately frustrates Lee. Lee spends a good portion of the first part of the film watching as Allerton sits at a bar with a woman who may or may not be his girlfriend. Lee ponders over the true direction of Allerton's desires and whether he might want anything to do with Lee. Together, Allerton and Lee represent a spectrum of masculinity the story of Queer portrays. On one hand, we have a man who is openly fallible, tripping over his shoelaces as he tries to flirt, and frankly can barely look after himself. The other oozes a surface level coolness whilst being frustratingly ambiguous. He is also fickle with what he wants to do, his unpredictable nature changing how much he is willing to share. This sets the stage for a push and pull relationship that drives our story forward. I mentioned earlier that there were several metaphors throughout the film. Some I'm not sure warrant too much analysis because frankly they're very literal expressions. For example, in the moments after Lee and Allerton consume the yahe, they vomit up their own hearts. Other metaphors do require a deeper background knowledge to contextualize them. I was quite fascinated by the repeated imagery of a centipede. We see it in the opening sequence, and we later see a man Lee spends the night with wearing a gold centipede necklace. In the book, there is a specific section that speaks to this. In this chapter, Lee is in Ecuador and he is fascinated by the lustful freedom the local men have. In the passage, Lee wonders, what happens when there is no limit? What is the fate of land where anything goes? Men changing into huge centipedes, centipedes besieging the houses, a man tied to a couch and a centipede 10 foot long rearing up over him. Is this literal? Did some hideous metamorphosis occur? What is the meaning of the centipede symbol? The way I see it, the centipede is the way in which Lee sees himself, but more specifically, it's the way in which he sees himself under the control of his own sense of lust. There's something creepy about the way in which he sees himself, and what he yearns for. He wanders the streets of Mexico City in search of sexual gratification, but the people he interacts with are solely there to serve that function. Lee does not relate to them in any other way. In the film, Luca Guadagnino chooses to associate these ideas by having one of Lee's lovers wear a gold centerpiece necklace. It's an interesting choice, the gold showcasing something that is shiny and desirable, but a centipede is unsettling. This is a twisted sense of desire and self-disgust. So you could think of Lee as the centipede, crawling along the streets, searching and searching.
If you look closely, it's hanging on the neck of the guy. It's crawling on the mattress. I think is in a way. I think at the bottom line. Both men, William Lee, Daniel Craig, and Eugene Allerton, Drew Starkey, they are both. They have the bug or the illness of repression. They are repressed.
So that's what it represents.
They cannot find a way to give up completely repression and live their life together. So the centipede, in a way, is that repression that crawls constantly between them.
There's a section of the film which also occurs in the book's 4th chapter, in which Lee meets a man who says he's been diagnosed with an Oedipus complex. Lee finds this funny to hear. At a different point in the film, Luca Guadagnino builds on this idea. Lee has a disturbing dream sequence where he stumbles into the naked floating image of his mother. She speaks out condescension whilst looking down at Lee, and she questions his queerness.
Aren't you queer?
It's notable that Lee's mother is depicted as being disembodied. She's naked but absent of her arms and legs. This sort of idea is an aspect of the book that tackles the idea of queerness beyond just being about sexuality. The Oedipus complex is a Freudian idea where a child has an unconscious physical attraction to a parent of opposite gender. Whilst not being directly relevant to Lee, the principal idea of alienation, the struggles with desire, power and relationships, is exactly what's being discussed here. This is a horrifying moment for both Lee and the audience to experience, and I suppose gives a sense that somebody who feels disembodied would see others as being that. There's that word again, disembodied. Again, this is a film that's trying to play with the idea of queerness and is exploring the limits of its full definition.
He's kind of queering what it means to be queer in that era. And queer, by the way, in 1952 does not mean pride. It's an adjective used only to stigmatize people. So again, he's going against the grain in doing this.
I like the guy, but I can't stand to be alone with him. He keeps trying to go to bed with me. That's what I don't like about queers. Can't keep it on the basis of friendship.
There is a section of the book in which Lee and Allerton are lying down together and Lee talks flirtatiously. He says, "If I had my way, we'd sleep every night together, all wrapped around each other like hibernating rattlesnakes." This is not something Allerton responds warmly to. Towards the end of the film, we see an extended dream sequence that includes Lee stumbling over a snake. The snake is eating its own tail and crying. This certainly speaks to the knotted feeling of guilt and longing that Lee feels, where by being obsessive with his displays of affection, Lee is actually forcing Allerton away and in turn hurting himself. In this same section of the book, Lee says to Allerton, "Wouldn't it be beautiful if we just run together into one great big blob?" Luca Guadagnino finds a way to adapt this idea literally. When Lee and Allerton sit by the campfire and fuse into one amorphous being, Lee is someone who longs so desperately after another person. He literally wants to live inside their skin. This is a powerful way to represent a desperate longing. I should also add this scene is not from the book. The book was left unfinished, and upon finding Cotter, who by the way is a man in the book, Cotter never helps the pair find the Yahé. Lee and Allerton return from their South American excursion, never knowing what the Yahé really was, and more importantly, what it could have really shown them. When you read the wrap-up of this, it is very abrupt, and then it's followed by a time-jumped epilogue, so you definitely feel the missing chapters to this story. I think the solution that Luca Guadagnino and company found is quite extraordinary. With the book, you're left with this vacant feeling of being robbed of a resolution. The film, however, gives you that resolve, but also confronts the characters with each other. Lee gets his wish of telepathy, and indeed true understanding of Allerton, but in turn he is also confronted with himself. Allerton says the phrase,
"I'm not queer, I'm disembodied,"
which is something Lee once said. There's this strange sense of sympathy between the two men, in spite of their differences, and also an uncomfortable reality that regards how they see themselves. The life of the character of Lee bears a striking similarity to the book's author, William S. Burroughs. Don't make the mistake in thinking Queer is an autobiography though.
It's not William Burroughs, it's a projection of Burroughs. It's not meant to be Burroughs, so it's not a biopic. I'm going to get confused thinking this is what William Burroughs was like. He wasn't like that. This is one side of him.
Yeah.
which he projected out. And if I put it this way, most of us these days do our best to airbrush ourselves.
Yeah.
We like to look our best, yeah? And this, if you imagine, is actually looking your absolute worst. What's the worst part of you? And Burroughs was interested in confronting that and projecting it.
Okay, so this is a story in which the author is playing with a version of himself. This is perhaps why so much of Queer is weighted by self-consciousness. One of the central questions below the surface being, how do you see me? How do I see me? Understanding Burroughs' life will therefore bring a greater context to the story of Queer. In the early 1950s, William Burroughs found himself on the run. After being caught owning unlicensed firearms, Burroughs and his wife, Joan Vollmer, fled to Mexico City. Their life there was a real breakdown in their marriage. Burroughs was struggling with the withdrawals from heroin and would also wander the streets looking for men to sleep with. In his absence, Vollmer began to drink heavily and would openly mock Burroughs. One night, the two of them were drinking at a party above Bounty Bar in Mexico City. The alleged interaction that Burroughs and Vollmer had at this event is said to have gone like this. Burroughs took out his firearm and said to Vollmer, "It's time for our William Tell act." Vollmer allegedly obliged Burroughs' request and placed a glass on her head. Burroughs then fired a shot that missed the glass and hit her forehead instead, killing her instantly. At the time of this incident, the couple had a son together, William S. Burroughs Jr., and Vollmer also had a daughter, Julie Adams. This event came to define Burroughs' entire life, as well as influence other writers at the time, like Allen Ginsberg. Burroughs himself only began to write significantly after this event, and it's why so much of his writing is an exploration of guilt, love, and identity. Luca Guadagnino understood this moment's significance to the writing of Queer, and as such, he opted to add a scene that's not in the book, but plays its direct reference to this tragedy. Towards the end of the film, in an extended dream sequence, we see Lee and Allerton recreate the scenario as Burroughs and Vollmer. I think this is very apt because it's deliberately confrontational to the author's moment of pure guilt, which in a way is exactly what the entire story of Queer is trying to explore. In the years after this incident, Burroughs became an author with intention of initially publishing 2 books. Junkie, which follows the character of William Lee as he struggles with addiction issues whilst in a tumultuous marriage. He then wanted to publish a sequel called Queer, which focuses more on Lee's sexuality. The unfinished manuscript for Queer was rejected by the publishers, and Lee subsequently lost interest in it. Many of his initial ideas for the book ended up in Junkie instead, which did end up getting published in 1953. Several decades later, in the 1980s, Burroughs was approached with a publishing contract, which was a lucrative financial offer for him. Part of this deal was including the publishing rights to Queer.
So when they came to publishing it and they found the manuscript, they realized it's really short, It was like 25,000 words, and he cut the first quarter of it anyway to put into Junkie. So what are they going to do? So they had to find some unused material from the same area, which was from this made the epilogue. And they stuck that on. And this was James Grauholtz with really intuitive insight, because it fits brilliantly, but it came from a separate manuscript. And then they got Burroughs to write a long introduction. So this was a way of bulking out a manuscript to make it worth the publishing.
The so-called finished version of Queer has sort of been Frankenstein together and is slightly removed from its original intention. It's now a book out of time. Recognizing this, Luca Guadagnino has decided to play with this concept. Throughout the film, we hear various needle drops, but they're not from the era in which the film is based in. These include songs by Prince, Nirvana, and Sinead O'Connor, music from the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, among other eras. All of this builds to the frame of reference in which we're supposed to regard Queer, one step removed, in a space beyond which the story is being told. Lee is ultimately a puppet for Burroughs, and we need to understand that frame of intention. Guadagnino is using the devices of cinema to play with this idea. This is also why the film can have Lee jump across time and space. When it comes to it, this is a story which examines feelings, memories, and moments in time above conventional narrative. The medium of film lends itself naturally to this, as we can edit in non-linear ways and play with perspective. This brings me on to how we should consider the ending. As mentioned previously, the ending in the book sees Lee and Allerton never finding the Yahé. It then abruptly time jumps to an epilogue which is initially very close to the film. Some time has passed and Lee returns to Mexico City asking what happened to Allerton, who he has since lost contact with. He learns that the assumption is that Allerton went back to the jungles of South America in search for the Yahé. In the book, Lee then describes how he had a dream that night where he found Allerton once again. In the dream, Lee sees himself as a government official, or as he describes, a friendly finance company man. He then goes on to explain that they absolutely have to meet and Allerton has to pay attention to him as he failed to read the small print of a contract he signed. The language becomes surrealist and nonsensical as the finance man seemingly starts to melt in front of Allerton. The finance man is described as having hideous features, yellow, hard ivory teeth and purple-blue fingertips. As he's seemingly collapsing, he lets slip a few $1,000 bills that scatter towards Allerton's feet. Upon reaching Allerton, the finance man then reanimates and apologises for the inconvenience. He goes on to explain that he'll perhaps sort out Allerton's debt another time. Lee's desperate feelings of transactional love and self-loathing are pretty clear here. Here's the question for you though. How do you adapt this appropriately for a film? Well, you could literally recreate this scene, but I feel that part of what makes the scene unique is its manipulation of literature. Burroughs can be surrealist, metaphorical, sarcastic and turgid with how he places words within a sentence. I think what Luca Guadagnino has done in confronting this adaptation is really fascinating, and still manages to remain true to the surrealist nature of the text. First, let's consider perspective. In the book, the story is told from Lee's perspective, and is therefore written in the first person as a result. When Lee starts to describe his dream, the perspective switches to the third person, and that's when he refers to himself as the friendly finance man. This is the textbook Burroughs thing of playing with a character as a projection of oneself in order to confront your inner demons. In the film, Lee's dream plays out with Lee, first person, noticing a smaller version of his apartment block. He then bends downwards and peers into the stage of his own life, viewing himself in the third person. Lee enters a room where he sees Allerton. He nearly trips over a knotted snake eating itself and crying. Allerton is seemingly trapped under glass. This is a version of Allerton that has been frozen in place in Lee's mind, the version his lust can't let go or see past. The two figures then begin to recreate the incident of Burroughs killing his wife. This is the ultimate form of internal confrontation that perhaps only Luca Guadagnino and not Burroughs would have the confidence to include. I find it interesting though that it's difficult to necessarily read the emotional tone of this moment. Lee and Allerton don't seem particularly happy, but instead Lee seems traumatized and incapable of stopping his action, whilst Allerton is emotionally vacant. After the gun is shot and the glass rolls on the ground, Lee is emotionally confused. He's giddy with a momentary amusement before being hit with a painful sense of loss. And then, snap. In the blink of an eye, decades have passed, and here we are. Lee is an old man, alone, lost within his own memories, depicted in exactly the way Burroughs was as an old man. He lies down, and whilst in this position we see Allerton's leg resting on his. This shows that even after all this time, that simple gesture resonated so much with Lee. It's the last thing he holds onto, the last slip of memory of Allerton from a specific point in his life. In this position, Lee then fades into cosmic dust. To me, this speaks to Lee's desire of spiritual ascendance over normality, but also it speaks to the idea that to be queer is to have a soul that is otherworldly, a heavenly creature, someone disembodied. When I really start to think about it, so much of queer is about perspective. How do we choose to view ourselves? The part at the end where Lee gazes into his apartment is of course Burroughs, the author, looking at Lee playing out his own guilt. But this principal idea is also something to be applied to the whole film. The entire film is stagecraft. That's why there's out-of-time needle drops but also miniature works, and I'd even argue that slightly heightened VFX is a deliberate choice to add to this. I found Daniel Craig's performance to be quite surprising, and I think recent years have really showcased his range as an actor. I should also add that in retrospect, Skyfall now feels like the most Burroughsy Bond film ever made. When I first saw this film, I knew nothing about Burroughs or this story. I was therefore seeing Daniel Craig playing this highly flawed persona called Lee. I was so overwhelmed by the film that it gave me a lot to chew on. Then in making this video, I spoke to Luca Guadagnino's consultant, Oliver Harris, who is a world-leading expert on Burroughs, and I also read the book. And when I came back to rewatching Queer after all that, I was suddenly confronted by a new performance. I was seeing Daniel Craig as Burroughs, or at the very least I could see the Burroughs behind the performance of Lee. I found that quite astonishing. Drew Starkey is also perfectly cast as Allerton. It's a tricky part because you have to remember that we're seeing a character entirely from Lee's viewpoint. So Drew Starkey has to be acutely aware of what not to show just as much as what he can show. Allerton is an alluring figure who catches Lee's attention, but he has an emotional detachment that should make him difficult to read. That can be a real acting challenge to get right and not seem like you're just giving a wooden performance. I think Drew Starkey nails the balance. Together on screen, we're seeing tender and electric cinema. I was also struck by the strong art direction, which is becoming a consistent staple of Lucas' filmography. As we watch Allerton gently smile at us before dipping out of the light cast by street lamps, I'm reminded of the paintings of Tamara de Lempicka, whose work features elegant, perfectly cut figures that play out in glamorous scenes. The period hats and clothes worn by men in the film also reminds me of Edward Hopper. In any case, clear visual references is definitely being drawn on here. Overall, it makes for an elegant and delicately considered adaptation of Burroughs' work. When I spoke to Oliver Harris, I really loved what he had to say about Luca Guadagnino's approach to adaptation by talking about the song choices.
So the way I would see the relationship between the film's character and the novella's character is a bit like the opening song of the film, which I love. It's a song that most people might recognize if they hear it. It's Nirvana, All Apologies. But instead of having Kurt Cobain singing it, it's Sinead O'Connor. And her version is haunting, it's true to the original, but it's softer and more beautiful. And I would say that this is Guadagnino's version of Burroughs. It's true to the original, but it's a softer, more beautiful, more haunting version of the original. And that's therefore quite a clever cover to begin your own film with, because his film is like a cover of Burroughs.
At the time when I saw the film, I had just begun editing a queer short film that I had written and directed during the summer. Seeing and learning about the film has honestly helped bolster my confidence as a filmmaker. My film also labours on similar cerebral ideas and also takes abstract ways of exploring them. The core idea being, maybe if I could just see inside you, maybe if I could just see right through you, I could finally understand you. Maybe you could finally understand me, and maybe we could finally see a place where we belong. At the time I shot my film, these were instinctive choices that came from my gut, and I was burdened by the responsibility of representing queer people appropriately. So to see this movie was an amazingly reassuring experience. I hope to share more about my film, Rest Your Head, on this channel in the future. But for now though, I need to ask, what do you think? Queer is a complex film, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. I read all the comments and I try to respond to as many as I can, so let's continue this conversation. As mentioned up top, please consider subscribing and leaving a like on the video. It really helps this channel out, and I really appreciate it. Now, to wrap up this video, I want to leave you with a poem written by Florence Welch that was used as part of her music videos for her third album. I think it speaks to William Burroughs' work perfectly.
Lucy.
Tequila.
Yep.
To give yourself over to another body. That's all you want, really. Out of your own and consumed by another. To swim inside the skin of your lover. Not to have to breathe, not to have to think. But you can't live on love. And salt water's no drink.
I know. I'm disembodied.
You're dying of thirst, so we feast on each other. The seas are still our violent mother. The blood round here pours down like water. Each wave a lamb led to the slaughter. And like children that she just can't teach, we break, and break, and break, and break ourselves upon the beach.